And now it's my pleasure to welcome Rev Pam McMillan, ordained elder in the United Methodist Church with a background in chaplaincy, bereavement support, and community engagement. We're going to talk today about religion and millennials.
As Beth said, my name is Pam McMillan. I have the joy and privilege of speaking here today. I actually do a fair amount of speaking throughout the community. So because I serve as a hospice chaplain, I'm not necessarily set to be at one particular faith community, but I do a fair amount of traveling on Sundays. I have also spoken quite a few times over at Friendship Fellowship Unitarian over in Rockledge area. And I also am incredibly involved in Interfaith United, which is a program that you may be quite familiar with. And before we get started, my credentials in the topic of millennials and spirituality, I'm 35. So I think I can speak on this. Yeah, so I think we got that. So I'm going to actually start today by talking not exactly about millennials, but I want to start by talking about Vincent van Gogh. Bear with me. You see, much is known about the Dutch post-impressionist painter Van Gogh. He painted masterpieces like a vase with 15 dandelions. He cut off a portion of his own left ear in a rage-fueled confrontation with a friend, and posthumously became one of the most influential painters in the Western world. But a much lesser-known fact about Van Gogh is that he attempted and spectacularly failed at being a missionary and a minister. Though he wanted to follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, who were both Dutch Reformed Protestant ministers, he got off to, let's say, a rocky start. He failed the theological entrance exam for the University of Amsterdam and then also failed a 3-month course at a Protestant missionary school. But he was undeterred and decided to take a missionary placement at a coal mining district in Belgium at just 25 years old. Now, I love this part of the story. He was so inspired by his teachings he had been raised in, he promptly gave all of his possessions to local miners. He gave up the comfortable lodgings provided to him by the church to a homeless person and instead chose to live a life in a small hut, sleeping on hay, wanting to embody the life of Jesus Christ. However, this stunt of giving away all of his possessions did not endear him to his congregation. The church authorities dismissed him for, quote, undermining the dignity of the priesthood. Vincent van Gogh left the church bitter and impoverished. In a letter he wrote to his brother Theo, he said, quote, I wish they would only take me as I am. Now I'm going to ask Beth to put up an image for you all. It is a much more familiar image that you might be aware of with Van Gogh. And you may be able to see it from here. You might not. But if you have seen this before, I want to point out something to you. You notice that at the bottom of this image, there are a number of homes and houses, that in the midst of the starry night, there are lights that are on. However, there is one building that has its lights turned off. Any idea which building that is? It's the church. It's the church that has its lights turned off. And every other home is lit in the midst of a starry night. I had the privilege of seeing this at first person in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, and it was so surrounded by people snapping pictures and taking selfies. And knowing this fact, I stood in front of this painting and just wept, because I saw it firsthand. The light of the church had been turned off because of the ways he had been rejected and turned away. In a nutshell, my generation's relationship with religion and spirituality is much like this image. The church, for many of us, has turned off its light, communicating that no one is home and millennials are absolutely not welcome. But just look outside of those doors and you will find brilliant swirls of color and brushstrokes of vibrancy, all telling a story that there is light and beauty even in the darkest of places. So let's talk for a moment about who millennials are. As a quick aside, I want to just really quickly, is anybody here a millennial? You're a cusper, okay. So I would like to point out that you now trust me in everything that I say, and no one can correct me. But I do want to make a couple of aside notes because we have to just be aware of that. The first is the facts that I share may not be relevant to all millennials, but are meant to capture a general sense of who millennials are. Secondly, it is not meant to further the divide between generations, which I'm telling you, news is already trying to do that as much as humanly possible. I love this quote from Pew Research President Michael Dimick, sagely notes that, quote, generations are a lens through which to understand societal change, rather than a label with which to oversimplify differences between groups. So bear that in mind as I'm talking, that the millennial generation may be a way to help us understand the way that the world is moving and changing societally. And lastly, and most importantly, I would love to say that this is going to be a guide for how you can get millennials into your congregation. And the truth is, I don't have a plan for you for what that will look like. All I can do is offer you what I know, what I have known from my personal experience, and hopefully shed some light that may be helpful as you can extend an olive branch to this generation. Now, some facts about millennials. Millennials are the generation born between 1981 and 1996, making millennials around the age of 27 to 42. And as a 35-year-old, I'm smack in the middle. There are approximately 72 million millennials in the United States, making them the largest generation in the country at this moment. Millennials are more educated, as 40% have a bachelor's degree or higher, compared with 30% of Gen X and 25% of baby boomers. Millennials are more likely to postpone marriage and children than previous generations, choosing to focus on careers and personal development first. Now, despite more education, millennials are experiencing higher debt and lower levels of wealth compared to previous generations. Increased housing prices, crippling student loan debts, lower salary rates, and increased inflation means that young millennials are now making up only 14% of home purchases in 2022. One economist said that we're now seeing for a first-time home buyer who is now closer to 40 than they are to 30. And millennials are one of the first generations who may never match or surpass their parents' careers and salaries, and many may never own their own home. Millennials are the most racially and ethnically diverse generation in history, with over 40% identifying as non-white. And finally, we are the first global generation that grew up with the internet. And because of that, we are sometimes called digital natives. Over 90% of millennials in the US own and use a smartphone. Now, one thing I have often heard about millennials is that we are called the participation trophy generation. Have you heard that before? I want to point out, we never asked for those. Those were given to us by our parents. But our generation may be better defined by the large scales of traumas we have had to endure as we were developing and growing. When our brains were still developing and we were learning things like our alphabets and multiplication tables in elementary school, we remember watching the live television footage of the first foreign attack on American soil since Palm Harbor when the Twin Towers fell. We stepped into adulthood and into our professional careers just in time for the Great Recession, the worst recession since the Great Depression. Now, as I reflect on 9/11, I had no clue what was happening as I watched the second tower before my first period of algebra. And as far as the Great Recession goes, I lost my financial safety net right after leaving college because my father lost his entire pool contracting business. Because who wants to add a pool to their home and when their values are at an all-time low? And then just when we got our sea legs under us into adulthood, we got hit with a global pandemic, the murder of innocent Black lives, and a coup to overthrow democracy. Now, please be aware, I am fully aware that these are things that have happened to all of us. We have all experienced these things firsthand. We lived through them. The difference with millennials is they began to happen at such a young age for us, when our brains, as I said, were still being developed, as our world, our concept was being shaped. Our norm has become what is unprecedented. Now, when it comes to religion and spirituality, some less surprising data to you. Approximately 1 out of 4 millennials are unaffiliated with any specific faith, much higher than previous generations at this moment at the same age. Only 41% of millennials say religion is very important to their lives, and only 27 attend religious services weekly. A recent Barna study found that 59% of millennials who grew up in church have dropped out at some point. When asked about their reasons for dropping out, they cited the church's irrelevance, hypocrisy, and the moral failure of leaders. Some expressed real spiritual needs that weren't addressed by the faith communities that they knew. Now, it's worth noting why this happened, why this is the case. And though there are several reasons, I only want to highlight a couple of them. The first one is conservative evangelicalism. For many millennials, the term religious, Christian, and evangelical have all become interchangeable. Conservative evangelicalism has lost credibility among younger generations, particularly with the incessant culture wars, political tribalism, and more currently, the overt display of discrimination, white nationalism, hypocrisy, and warmongering, and environmental carelessness. In churches, we have experienced a rejection of the LGBTQIA community. Millennials are more likely to identify as queer and LGBTQIA and accepting of queer individuals than all previous generations. Yet despite that, harmful religious teachings have caused extreme harm to this community, especially what we are seeing now in Florida. My goodness. Individuals encouraging practices like conversion therapy and worse, parents disowning their own children. I have a family member, an extended cousin, who is a trans male who lives in Boston, grew up here in Florida, and was raised in the church. And despite the fact that he now knows many ministers who are fully accepting and fully inclusive, he confessed to me that he has trouble even stepping into the foot of the door of a church because of the trauma that it caused him to be so rejected, the idea of even crossing the threshold of a congregation, of a sanctuary, causes a trigger of his trauma. Then there is purity culture. Books like, quote, I Kiss Dating Goodbye and the True Love Waits movement led in the 1990s and 2000s the purity culture movement. Our culture was so obsessed with controlling sexual narratives that virginity became a common topic among pop stars at the time. People were obsessed with whether or not Britney Spears was a virgin. Do you remember that? Purity culture has led to many experiencing shame and guilt about sexual behavior, impacting individuals' ability to form healthy and fulfilling sexual relationships. I confess that I was affected by this, as my parents threw me a purity ceremony at the age of 14 and did not tell me ahead of time. Yeah. Here's a fact from my personal experience, not from data, that may or may not shock you. I do not know a single person in my generation, including the most devout Christians and ordained ministers, who have not experienced harm at the hands of religion, much less religious trauma. We were fed lies based on fear instead of love. We were taught that we were only worthy of love if we obeyed and we stayed in line and discarded our individuality for the sake of the greater good. So, if not religion, where have millennials found spiritual meaning? Because even though we may have walked away from religion, it didn't mean that we did not have spiritual needs that had to be fulfilled. The first that I want to highlight is something that may be familiar to you called deconstruction. In many ways, deconstruction has been, pardon the phrase, a godsend. It has given us a permission slip to question and doubt, something many of us were taught to be wrong or evil. In reality, deconstruction has allowed us to disassemble the Lego castle of beliefs that was passed down to us from our parents and grandparents, and we got the chance to examine each block, keeping what is meaningful to us and learning when it's okay to discard the rest. It has given us a chance to make a faith of our own, beyond the walls of religion. Also, therapy and mental wellness. Millennials have also been called the therapy generation. Growing up, there was less of a stigma surrounding mental health. Rates of depression and anxiety have skyrocketed, in no small part to our brains developing after crisis and crisis. Rather than ignoring mental health care or shutting it down, considering it evil or less than, or you need to be strong enough and pray away your depression, our generation has found value and healing in personalized health treatments to find healing and break those patterns of behavior. We have also found a spiritual home in, believe it or not, digital platforms and social media. One of the most common criticisms I hear about millennials is that we are glued to our phones, complaining how we must be so disconnected from one another. In actuality, being a generation that has never known life without instantaneous connection to a global community has only set us up to utilize online platforms for interconnection and meaning. Platforms like Twitter, YouTube, podcasts, Reddit, and TikTok have allowed for the spiritual nomad to find their tribe, letting them know that they are not alone. Some of my best friends in this world are people I have never met face to face. And yet we have connected on these platforms and bonded over our own unique spiritual journeys. And millennials have a deep, abiding desire for justice. Millennials are increasingly more concerned with political and social injustice than their own personal spiritual needs. Young adults who have engaged in issues like housing inequality, the climate crisis, access to equitable health care for women, and basic human rights for all have found a home in sacred activism. Many young millennials find that maybe the church is not the place for them to push forward these ideas of social justice and equality, and so they must fight, they must protest to bring about social change here on the ground. Now, again, there are many different places where millennials have found a spiritual home. Individual spiritual practices outside of organized religion like meditation, yoga, or nature-based spirituality. Witchcraft and paganism have become increasingly more popular. They provide a connection to nature and a sense of community, as well as an alternative to the patriarchal and hierarchical structures of traditional religions. Metaphysical stores increase in the sales among young people, are like places where you can buy crystals and metaphysical objects. They're experiencing increased sales among younger people. There are humanist and secular communities which reject supernatural beliefs and focus instead on human ethics and values. And I even want to highlight this one, which might be a little surprising, but bear with me. Even Peloton. For those of you that are not familiar, there's this whole community of people, a company that makes these bikes where you can exercise at home and you're connected to people all over the world exercising at the same time as you, right? For some people, some millennials, that has become the place where they feel the most connected, the most sense of belonging. People crave it regardless of where they stand, regardless of what their life experience is. They will find it wherever they can. Older generations may scoff at the overuse of the term safe space. And while I can assure you that safe spaces have been necessary, what we need now more than ever are engaged spaces. Younger adults are too often dismissed and need space to be heard, to be acknowledged for what they can bring to the table, to be engaged for their hard-won, modernized knowledge. Posting service bulletins and announcements on Facebook isn't enough. We need to engage existing young people on how best leverage digital platforms for wider appeal, and then rely on their experience to follow through with such material. We should be asking these same people what social causes mean the most to them and empower them with the tools needed to safely succeed, including their friends, regardless of spiritual beliefs, in such activism and justice work, and then celebrate their efforts towards a better tomorrow. I leave you with this. We don't need participation trophies. We never did. What we need is for someone to turn on the light in the church window, to listen to our different experiences, and to accept us as we are. Thank you.